ado, Dr. Reno.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you. I realized that I should have come later in the year so that I could have enjoyed the snow and gone skiing. But I guess late October and early November are like late March and early April. They're the in-between times. But it's a very beautiful location, and it's a real pleasure to be able to spend the day today, both here at the school with the students and then in the afternoon walking around Petoskey. And so thank you, Rich, for inviting me. And as he said, I'm going to give a sort of tour d'horizon of what I see as happening in not just in our society, but throughout the West. A couple of weeks ago, a book that I recently wrote was published, Return of the Strong Gods. And this talk is going to take off from that book, develop some of the themes of that book, and hopefully provide some orientation to the challenges that we face as a country and as a culture. First things is religion, culture, and politics, and this talk is a little bit of all those things wrapped up into one. So my purpose this evening is to explain populism, which I take to be a political force that's upending not just the United States, but the West more broadly. Salvini, Brexit, obviously Trump, and there are other instances as well. My argument tonight will be that this populism reflects a rebellion against the consensus that emerged after World War II. So it's an historical thesis. And this consensus, what I'll call here in this talk the post-war consensus, I got to stop here to the young people here and tell them post-war means post-World War II. You know the post-war era is ending when people look at you with a blank look when you say post-war. So that was a long time ago, 75 years ago, so it's understandable. So it's a rebellion against the post-war consensus, which emphasized motifs of openness, spontaneity, creativity, and innovation. All kind of feel-good words, I think, in our time. And this consensus was formulated in order to prevent the return of the strong gods. This is my image of the powerful passions and loyalties that were thought to be the sources of fascism, militarism, war, and totalitarianism. So this post-war consensus explains that this post-war consensus explains why so many think of the wall, between Mexico and the United States, as a sign of resurgent racism, and why some people fear Trump's election as a sign of a return of authoritarianism. It's also why establishment Democrats and establishment Republicans tend to be anti-populist. These motifs of openness enjoy the prestige of anti-fascism. In each instance, failures to affirm openness are treated as endorsements of gulags and concentration camps. This is my historical thesis. So now I'll make a further case at the end of this talk that this consensus has become dysfunctional. This is when I pivot towards an analysis of the contemporary scene. We're going to spend a lot of time on how we got to where we are, and I'll pivot towards the end towards an analysis of the present scene. That the consensus has become dysfunctional. It prevents us from addressing the challenges of the 21st century, which I'm going to argue revolve around a lack of solidarity and shared loves rather than the dangers of fortified borders, resurgent racism, or fascism. So that's the agenda. That's the roadmap for where we're going this evening. So, the historical analysis. Even as World War II was raging, the philosopher of science Karl Popper worked to complete a book that became quite famous after the war, Open Society and Its Enemies. The title was Open Society and Its Enemies. It's a 2-volume diagnosis of the civilizational madness that led to the global conflict of World War II. So by Karl Popper's reckoning, civilization, as the war was ending, faces a choice. We can live, and this is his way of thinking about it, we can live in a tribal, or in his language, a closed society characterized by deference to authority and the subordination of the interests of the individual to the needs of the whole. Or we could break free from this collectivist impulse, is the term he uses, and build an open society, the image that he puts in the very title of his book. And this is a society that, quote, sets free the critical powers of man. And the future of the West depends upon choosing the latter, choosing the open society, or at least that's what Karl Popper argues in that 2-volume book. Now, the imperative that operates throughout open society and its enemies is really very bracingly simple. The imperative is never again. Never again shall we permit totalitarian governments to emerge. And in the service of this imperative, we need to banish the strong gods that preside over closed societies, and we need to create an open society that is organized around the free individual. Now, one of the strong gods in the West is the nation itself, the nation state. And so it's part of Popper's project to try to overcome loyalty to the nation. Because according to his analysis, we're tempted to imagine that our solidarity is in some sense a sacred thing. And this gives the community a rightful claim upon our loyalty. Now, Popper regards this, as he uses this term, magical thinking, a form of what he calls anti-humanitarian propaganda. By his reckoning, only the individual is sacred. Now, Popper knows that there will always be what he calls state worshipers, or other proponents of, again, the term he uses again and again is collectivism. And they must be dealt with firmly, according to Popper. Anyone who relishes his homeland and its history is what Popper calls a racialist, or effectively a racist. And this anticipates today's rhetoric of anti-racism. It's like a lot of immigration debates today you get to this sort of charge of racism very quickly if you are in favor of limiting immigration, especially, or even if you're even if you want to limit illegal immigration. But so this Popper's aware, why would someone become a so-called state worshiper, especially after witnessing the disastrous consequences of National Socialism? He's writing against that background, thinking of that all the time. Now, in Open Society and Its Enemies, Popper proposes a psychological explanation that has been really quite widely adopted. Popper hypothesizes that we feel a kind of strain when we live in a society that's governed by his terms, democracy and individualism. The collectivist, or the proponent of a closed society, promises something easier. He promises a warmer and more comforting existence. Social authority, in other words, like paternal authority, is attractive to those who are insecure and fearful. This is the Popper psychological analysis. Intimidated by the personal responsibilities that freedom brings, we long for the security of obedience. It's amazing. You read this book written in 1944 during the war, and it's amazing how this mode of analysis is everywhere and with us to this day. The closed and tribal society, in other words, Popper is arguing, is psychologically soothing and reassuring. It helps us to avoid the tension of what he calls the ever-widening range of personal decisions with its problems and responsibility. You think of Barack Obama's comment about those who weren't voting for him as those who cling to their guns and religion. So the whole idea of being a clinger, you're clinging to something that makes you feel secure and safe, and you lack the courage to embrace true openness, diversity, and freedom. That's the So it comes right out of Popper. I mean, it's unfair to say it comes from Popper. Popper is distilling a certain sentiment or a certain way of thinking that really came into the fore after World War II. Now, against this temptation, the temptation of security and safety, we must gird our loins. Popper insists that we must embrace our freedom with courage rather than deferring to authority out of cowardice. Only the open society can save us from the return of totalitarianism, and that's the main thrust of this 2-volume work. Now, the way that the Open Society and its enemies proceeds to prevent this temptation is that really the bulk of the 2 volumes are devoted to an attack on the metaphysical tradition of the West, especially in the person of Plato. And Karl Popper sees that any form of transcendence is implicitly totalitarian. I think that's really what he sees in metaphysics. To claim that there is something higher than the individual really sets up a supra-personal authority. Long before the invention of words such as logocentrism and heteronormativity, these are the sorts of terms that get bandied about in the university context. Long before the invention of these words, back during World War II when he's writing the book, Karl Popper cast all strong truth claims as threats to freedom and midwives to the rebirth of totalitarianism. According to Popper, strong truths are strong gods. As a consequence, they pose a threat to liberal norms, and they're enemies of an open society. I mean, we think we see this today, non-judgmentalism, or what Pope Benedict called the dictatorship of relativism, is a moral project. It's not nihilism, or at least it doesn't seek nihilism. Instead, it seeks to neuter strong truth claims so that people won't become authoritarians and totalitarians. In this context, we need public reason. That's the term that John Rawls, a very influential political philosopher in the second half of the 20th century, that's how he put it 2 decades after Popper. And public reason also means an anti-metaphysical and often procedural approach in which truth claims are limited to what can be assessed empirically by those who have command of the relevant data. So in Popper's terms, we don't need politics in the classical sense, which always involve arguments about how we should live, arguments that invariably outrun the domain of what can be subjected to social scientific analysis. Rather, I think for Popper and for Rawls, our politics needs to go small. It's the kind of image I have. Not big ideas, but small ideas. Not big truths, but small truths. It should be scientific, in other words, not metaphysical. This is a great quote from Karl Popper. He writes, quote, "A social technology is needed whose results can be tested by social engineering," end quote. In this respect, Popper anticipates the reduction of public life to wonkish debates about how to allocate utilities. I think a technocracy, in other words. Now, this politics of an open society seems to beg an important question. What is freedom for? Historically, the West has appealed to metaphysics and religion for answers to that question. What are we supposed to use our freedom for? Now, Popper's aware of this question, and he gives an existentialist answer of the sort that Albert Camus and other existentialists would make popular in the 1950s. We must accept, in other words, he says, what he calls the strain of freedom. We need to courageously embrace the existential tension from knowing that we must decide for ourselves the ends that our freedom are to serve. It's up to us, in other words, we need to define the truths that we need in order to make our lives worth living. Here's Popper says this in his book, and he puts it in italics. Quote, "Although history," I got to say it with the proper italicized sense, "although history has no meaning, we can give it meaning," end quote. This very truth about reality depends upon, in other words, the very truth about reality depends upon us. Again, this is a quote from Popper. Facts as such have no meaning. They gain it only through our decisions. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche, do you guys read Nietzsche in
Senior year.
senior year?
Yeah, we're getting them going.
Okay, so
Race them.
Friedrich Nietzsche thought it would take a superhuman strength for someone to self-consciously give himself his own truth. I mean, he thought you would have to be a Superman, an Ubermensch, in order to be able to really have the courage to say, I am going to give myself my own truth. In other words, and only a strong God, a kind of, overman, an Ubermensch, can mint truths rather than to discern and obey them. And this is certainly not what Karl Popper wants. His objective is modesty, not self-assertion. He therefore hedges throughout Open Society and its enemies. He substitutes meaning for truth. And this move characterizes the post-war era, which can, it's interesting, if you go on Google, you can track word usage because they've digitized libraries and everything. And after 1945, there's a big spike in the use of the word meaning. And it makes sense because meaning is a deflationary term. It's a soft term, whereas truth is a strong term. Meaning is a weak term. And this move toward meaning, it characterizes the post-war era in general. And this era consistently adopts a deflationary policy when it comes to truth. It doesn't always go all the way to the dictatorship of relativism, but if you think about it, values, that's another deflationary term, because they're kind of subjective as opposed to objective, meaning rather than truth. So Popper weakens, in other words, the strong God of truth rather than tries to keep it narrowly scientific. And then when we need a guiding or commanding language with which to govern our lives and set standards for society, we appeal to meaning. And this is a kind of characteristic weakening move. Truth are the facts of science. Values are the domain of meaning. And this way of dividing things allows for a general kind of lowering of the temperature of things. So like so much else in the Open Society and enemies, the shift from truth to meaning is required, I think, by what Popper sets up as a kind of Manichaean, all or nothing political choice that the years between 1914 and 1945 seem to press upon the West. In other words, the disasters of 1914 and 1945 seemed to create an atmosphere where it felt like we had an all or nothing choice. Either an open society or the horrors of Auschwitz. In the face of such a choice, the search for transcendence becomes an evil endeavor rather than reflecting a healthy human desire. So by Popper's account, we are tempted to elevate truths and pledge our troth to them, setting us on the road back to totalitarianism. The only way out of this trap is to adopt a double pattern of weakening by going small with value-free, fact-based truth and satisfying the larger needs of the human heart with an ambiguous rhetoric of meaning. I think the summary of Open Society and its enemies, 2 volumes condensed into 15 minutes. Now, the 2 volumes of Open Society and its enemies that I have at home are a first edition, published in Great Britain in 1945 as American soldiers were liberating the Buchenwald concentration camp and Berlin was in ruins. The signature in the front shows that it was bought by James B. Conant, then president of Harvard University, and one of the top civilian leaders of the Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. His discreet markings in the margins indicate that he read the entire book with interest, especially parts where Popper expounds his conviction that, quote, an attitude of reasonableness must serve as the basis for a democratic society. Now, James Conant was no moral relativist, and I would submit nor was Karl Popper. They trusted in science, and they believed in the intellectual virtues of impartiality, honest debate, and close attention to empirical data. Although the Axis powers have been overcome, the future remained uncertain in their minds. And they were not alone. The Soviet Union's aggressive stance in the immediate aftermath of the war dramatized the totalitarian temptation. As a consequence, concerns about the dangers of a closed society were widespread among the leaders of democracies in the post-war West. And their counsel was consistently one of vigilance. The virtues of the open society, I think the consensus came to agree, must be championed. And the leaders of the West believed that our culture needed a thoroughgoing reconstruction to forestall the return of the strong gods. Whether directly inspired by Popper or not, the establishment American liberalism of the sort that Conant represented moved in the direction of empiricism combined with meaning-oriented rhetoric that inevitably punted when it came to metaphysical foundations. As George Marsden, a very eminent American historian, explains in his account of post-war politics in America, the book is titled The Twilight of American Liberalism, the 1950s and the Crisis of Liberal Belief. According to Marsden, the older consensus, the pre-war consensus about natural rights, gave way to a liberal consensus about the importance of consensus. And meaning, in fact, I would say, lends itself to an establishment-dominated politics, because meaning is more socially dependent than truth. I mean, meaning is kind of what kind of everybody thinks, or everybody feels, or everybody senses, rather than truth, which has an objective quality. Belief in the 1950s, belief in a new post-ideological way of life was widespread after World War II. Social scientists and psychologists such as Abraham Maslow, Karen Horney, and Rollo May, and others may not have read Karl Popper. Nevertheless, the ideas were in the air, and they developed his themes. They were concerned about the closed society of bourgeois sensibilities and morality, which were thought to be too constricting. If you look at the literature of the 1950s, all this anxiety about conformism and so forth. The middle-class milieu of the 1950s was glossed as conventionality, the psychosocial analog to Karl Popper's closed society. This was deemed an impediment to personal growth and authenticity. To counter these consolidating closed society pressures, influential psychologists of the era articulated therapeutic versions of the open society. At the same time, a new pop psychology of personal growth and self-realization remained scrupulously anti-metaphysical, again following Karl Popper. Not explicitly perhaps, but certainly as part of a larger and increasingly powerful post-war consensus. A therapeutic search for meaning supplanted the classical search for truth. I mean, if you look at this literature, the search for meaning supplants the search for truth. This search was framed with platitudes, all playing on the theme of openness in one key or another. So, for example, we're to grow towards greater meaning, or toward self-actualization, or towards autonomy, or this is what Hillary Clinton put it in her commencement speech from Wellesley at the end of the 1960s, we're to grow towards, quote, a fuller and more expressive way of being. They're all kind of vague, open-ended terms, which kind of fits with Popper's meaning vocabulary rather than truth, which is more definitive. It actually stipulates the end towards which you're supposed to grow. At first glance, it seems obvious that a politics without principle and growth without determinate ends must be, by definition, open and capacious, for there would be no basis on which to exclude any particular ideas or initiative. it is, of course, a fact that post-war liberals consistently complimented themselves for having exactly those qualities: openness, capaciousness, tolerance, and so forth. And some, I think in fairness, did in fact manifest Popper's hope for openness. But in the main, consensus liberalism in the 1950s and beyond, ever since 1945, consensus liberalism has punished dissent, often ruthlessly. It has consistently berated strong truth claims as signaling a return of illiberalism, fascism, or the other evils of the pre-1945 situation. And it's a mode of argument that is still very much with us today. The heightened rhetoric of anti-fascism continues to be prominent. Now, perhaps this should not surprise us. As Karl Popper makes clear, pragmatism in politics, in other words, the end of truth claims in public life, produces paradoxically strong political and cultural imperatives. Now, again, as anticipating your reading, seniors, Nietzsche recognized this fact about anti-metaphysical thinking, which is why he thought it would require a heroic will to power and not liberal tolerance. Because the open society, it requires denying principled political arguments and policies. Championing authenticity in personal life requires rejecting the authority of traditional moral norms. You can't get young people to embrace anti-authoritarianism without deconstructing authority. Thus, as the post-war consensus gained strength, it imposed what I call a negative piety, teaching us that we have a duty to the future of society and to the well-being of our children to banish from public life patriots, traditionalists, and religious believers. For these sorts of people are loyal to the strong gods, which are the underlying cause of fascism. As the students who were rioting in Paris in 1968 put it, it is forbidden to forbid. Far from being revolutionaries, I would submit, they had actually learned their lessons well, carrying forward many of the themes that we find in Karl Popper, a book written during World War II and so influential in the first years after the war. Now, as Karl Popper was working on Open Society and Its Enemies, Friedrich Hayek, another Austrian, also traumatized by National Socialism, was writing his own wartime book, The Road to Serfdom. And it too sought to guide the reconstruction of Europe after the defeat of fascism. Now, Hayek's analysis has a different feel. As an economist, his focus is narrower. During the war, England's economy, and for that matter, the economy of the United States, was transformed into a command and control system with production quotas, rationing, price controls, and wage boards. Hayek was horrified to learn that many intellectual leaders in England envisioned a continuation of these methods of economic planning once the war ended, and in order to redirect them towards peacetime objectives. And he wrote The Road to Serfdom to warn against the dire totalitarian consequences of this course of action. Now, Hayek frames the future in terms of a choice between individualism and collectivism. These two terms run like a red thread through The Road to Serfdom. The collectivist imagines society governed by powerful forces that weld individuals into a single we like, us. This pattern of thinking about social and political life, argues Hayek, characterized Hitler's race-based fascism as well as communism's class-based totalitarianism. Hayek is not as precise as Popper, but he intuits that resisting collectivism requires adopting an anti-metaphysical stance. The basic principle of individualism is individual liberty, which means we must resist anything, this is according to Hayek's way of thinking, we must resist anything that compels our choices, including, he's vague on this, but I think including perhaps solid and significant moral truths. The essence of individualism is the freedom every individual enjoys to be as this is Hayek's language, the ultimate judge of his ends. So in other words, I must have the liberty to decide for myself what is good and bad for me. Now we're kind of in the same realm of meaning that we were with Popper. In short, Hayek, like Popper, treats metaphysical realities, the social bond, moral truth, as threats to the individual. He too advocates a severe kind of what I would call an intellectual asceticism. Only the individual is real. Notions such as the general interest or the common good are at best placeholder terms for aggregations of individual interests and welfare. Politics should be concerned about maximizing individual freedom and utility, not promoting a common way of life or sustaining a moral community. That comes out pretty clearly in The Road to Serfdom. Although Popper and Hayek champion the individual against the collective, they don't agree across the board, any more than the center-left and center-right expressions of the post-war consensus have agreed on social policies over the last 70 years. Popper speaks warmly of the social technologists who adopt an empirical approach to governance. Hayek, by contrast, offers a thoroughgoing criticism of the technocratic approach. Against rational planning, he champions what he calls the spontaneous forces of society, paradigmatically the free market. And this is why he became a hero for post-war conservatives in the United States. The bulk of The Road to Serfdom argues for the free market against socialism. Our political goal, insists Hayek, should be to expand the range of individual freedom, which means we should bring as much as possible, as much of civic life as possible under the dominion of spontaneous market-organized relations. The more the market rules, in other words, Hayek argues, the safer we will be from the totalitarian temptation. For in Hayek's theory, the market mechanism is intrinsically anti-totalitarian. Now, as the post-war era grows old, the main thrusts that we find in Popper and Hayek have become ascendant. The post-war center-left, not just in the United States but in Europe more broadly, is home to the cultural project of openness. The anti-metaphysical stance, transgressions that are said to break down the authority of social norms and thus promote inclusion, and the politics of diversity and multiculturalism. These are all politics of openness, I would submit, very much in the Popper tradition. And this explains why the establishment post-war liberals could so easily absorb the seemingly revolutionary challenges of the 1960s and their outworkings over the last few decades. You know, it's an important historical question: is how is it that the liberal establishment was able to really basically take on board the radicalism, the cultural radicalism of the late 60s? I think because it fit. Because I think it didn't take much effort really to fit them into Popper's framework. By his way of thinking, explosions of traditional norms become expressions of anti-fascism. And I think this is why today transgenderism enjoys moral prestige for this reason. It's another explosion of conventional norms that creates an even more open society, an even greater protection of freedom for everyone. I think this is the way the left thinks about it. One can say that the center-left in the post-war era has become the party of cultural deregulation. I think it's my way of thinking. It's the party of cultural deregulation. Meanwhile, the center-right in the United States has become home to the promise of the free market as the source of social order that does not rely on normative authority, other than those that are necessary to maintain stable market mechanisms. So the European center-right laid the foundations for the open markets that evolved into the European Union. It was a Christian democratic center-right project at its outset. American and European center-right parties supported global economic liberalization after the fall of the Soviet Union. Although terms such as individualism and collectivism, these terms that motor the analysis of the road to serfdom have fallen by the wayside over the decades, the basic thrust of Hayek's approach animates right-leaning post-war consensus to this day. Freedom, peace, and prosperity, by this way of thinking, are best served by expanding the market's function as the foundational source of social order. And in this sense, the center-right is the party today of economic deregulation. Indiana, which is a Republican-dominated state last year, voted to repeal Sunday liquor laws, or prevented the sale of liquor on Sundays. And I know exactly what the argument was. The argument is that, well, people are free not to buy liquor, and now this expands freedom by expanding the market mechanism to all 7 days of the week. And so the more you expand the market choice, the freer people are and the more prosperous people are. So that's the kind of center-right consensus. Just like, for the center-left consensus, the more we break down traditional moral norms, the freer and more and happier people are in society. And then more and more, it seems to me, these parties have merged. And today we see a deregulatory spirit predominating, both in cultural and in economic life. And it goes under the name of neoliberalism. It's more evident in Europe than in the United States, but Macron in France is he's economic liberalization, which in Europe means deregulation, as well as continuing the cultural project of cultural deregulation in France. So or Angela Merkel, same thing. And the Christian Democratic Party in Germany has become the party of, it was always a market-friendly party, but over the last 20 years it's also adopted the cultural deregulation of the left. And so we see a kind of merging of this. Or if you look at the Republican National Committee's post-mortem after Romney's defeat in 2012, it could be read as, well, it's time for Republicans to embrace the deregulatory agenda, at least in a moderate fashion with respect to culture. So I look at Bill Clinton, the era of big government is over, 1992. No, that was actually 94 after he was responding to the big kind of crushing defeat during the midterm elections of Democrats. He said the era of big government is over. And what he was doing was signaling that we new Democrats accept the economic deregulatory project of Reaganism, but we're going to do it with greater concern for the working man, unlike the Republicans that only care about rich people. That's the kind of rhetoric of the left adopted. But basically accepting the deregulatory project, NAFTA, and so forth, being a kind of signal example of that. And then the Romney report, and maybe even George W. Bush with compassionate conservatism, was a kind of way of signaling the era of the religious right is over, and we Republicans are going to accommodate cultural deregulation, but we're going to do it with greater concern for people like you and me, and at least we'll protect your religious freedom. And so that, it seems to me, has been the rhetoric of the party until we got to 2016. And now in 2019, with the Democratic Party, in both cases, this is exploding. This consensus is exploding on both sides. You could say the wall is a powerful theme of cultural reconsolidation, and Elizabeth Warren's economic policies are a very powerful expression of economic reconsolidation. Both of them are heresies in the context of the post-war consensus of economic and cultural deregulation. All right, to the present moment. Well, I've already talked about the present moment. It seems to me that we face a crisis in the West. It is depicted in different ways. Some treat it as an illusion, a consequence of momentary derangements. Others warn that economic changes over the last few decades have broken the social contract between labor and capital that was established after World War II. Still others point to unrestrained immigration as the source of populism. And finally, some identify a spiritual malaise, one rooted in secularization and manifest in very low birth rates in Europe, a mentality that desires no future beyond the worldly self. It seems to me that there's something to be said for all of these explanations, even the one that treats the crisis as illusory. For it is my conviction that our troubles stem from the superannuated post-war consensus. The imperative of openness rather than the imperative of solidarity, and the preference for spontaneous order rather than a preference for authoritative order has led to what I would call an anti-politics that deprives us of the concepts that we need to meet the challenges facing the West in the 21st century. Here's an off-the-cuff list of those challenges. A series of questions. Should there be limits to globalization? And if so, set by whom and toward what end? Related, can we make the global economy work for middling folks in the West? 3, are we able to restore a shared moral community that protects the weak, not just from the strong? Abortion, I think, is the kind of classic example of the strong getting their way at the expense of the weak, but also protecting the weak from their own tendencies towards self-destructive vices. I mean, the crisis of decline in life expectancy among white working class people in the United States is catastrophic. It's at the level of the collapse of, it's at the level of Russia in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a very clear sign that something is deeply, deeply wrong in our society. 4, what is the future of America's global leadership? 5, how should we respond to mass immigration? 6, can we repair the broken trust between the establishment few and the demotic many? Because I think populism is really basically a sign of fundamental distrust of the many of the few. Those of you reading Plato will get to that problem in the Republic, about how can you convince the talented, powerful few that they should serve the interests of the not-so-talented many. It's not easy to do that. And conversely, how can you get the many to trust the few to lead them and serve their interests and not just their own? I think it's all of these questions revolve around the role of the nation in the 21st century, the nation state in the 21st century. And these are questions I think require us to ask deeper questions than we have been trained to ask by the post-war consensus. And they're questions that touch upon the essence of public life. And they are questions that revolve around the question of who are we? What is the common love that we share? What communal loyalties demand sacrifice? And who among us belongs to the we? Popper and Hayek rule out these questions. In an open society, they must not be asked, much less answered. For, according to this way of thinking, they lead to fascism. For the free market libertarian, the miracle of spontaneous order means that we need not ask or answer the question of the we. This comes out very clearly in Milton Friedman. Free trade will knit the world together. If we're just patient, the market will solve our political problems, which means we don't really need politics at all. As Popper and Hayek understood, in every political culture, this question of the we touches upon sacred things. The particular we is always a gift. Family membership, for instance, comes unbidden. I was not created a Reno. The same holds for the solidarity that we feel as distinct peoples. We were not created American or German or Polish. And of course, it's also true for the religious we as well, which comes from a divine source. These forms of solidarity are communities of love. They are love societies. They are political in the broadest and deepest sense. Because they require intentional effort in order to guide them and sustain them. Put differently, love societies don't just happen, but they rather require decisions. Which is why they require politics. Communities of love call for us to exercise our freedom under the virtue of prudence, which is a fancy way of saying that they must be governed. Now, the agony of the West in the 21st century rests in a crisis of solidarity. At every turn, we find solidarity in marriage, nation, and faith increasingly inaccessible. I mean, the declines in these areas are pretty significant. And you get these polling in Europe where like 80% of Germans said they would not fight for their country. And of course, declines in rate of marriage, and then in places like Europe, collapse in church-going. And we see this with data in the United States with younger people who are less and less affiliated with Christian churches. Now, these forms of the we are disintegrating. At the same time as they are in decline or under assault, we've inherited a political, cultural consensus, the post-war consensus, as I've described it, that accounts for that says that even efforts to articulate what we have lost are racist or crypto-fascist. So even to raise the question of who we are as a nation will evoke accusations of racism. And to say nothing of our efforts to renew solidarity. And I mean, I think about in the last first things that's been at the forefront of pushing these kinds of questions. So we've kind of made had a lot of press, and we've had a lot of press, and we had somebody from the Atlantic magazine came and interviewed me, and I've been interviewed now by a lot of these mainstream journalists, and they will ask me the only thing they really probe me on with question after question after question. It's always about immigration, and it's always designed to try to flush out whether I'm a white nationalist or not. In other words, that I would be concerned that our nation is coming apart, is disintegrating, and that we lack enough civic unity. That is invariably interpreted as a racial project, which is absurd. Anyway, it's been shocking to me over the last 9 months. It's a sign of how the ideology of an open society has become an enemy of what I call societies of love and loyalty. The strong gods are, in my way of thinking, you can look at the book to get a fuller account of this analysis. The strong gods are whatever evoke love, whether it's love of the divine, love of truth, love of country, love of family. The post-war consensus is fearful of love, which it rightly recognizes can sometimes lead to destructive devotions. Our consensus in favor of openness seeks to prevent these dangers by depriving us of love's objects, which means banishing the strong gods. It does so by critiquing, deconstructing, and deflating them. It has succeeded for the most part, and in so doing has brought calm to the West. But the post-war project of peace, calm and wealth to the West, but the post-war project of peace without love cannot go on much longer. I would submit, as St. Augustine said, where our heart is restless until it finds its rest in thee. I think the human person does not desire calm, not even when satiated by countless pleasures. As human beings, we yearn to join ourselves to others, not just in matrimony, but in religious and social bonds as well. The we arises out of love. It's a ferocious power that seeks to rest in something greater, to rest in loyalty to strong gods that are worthy of love's devotion and sacrifice. So I am more and more convinced that our political upheavals in the West reflect a crisis of the post-war consensus and its fixations on preventing the return of the strong gods in public life. And I think, in contrast to my friend Patrick Deneen, I don't think it's a crisis of liberalism or a crisis of modernity. This consensus and the elite devoted to it deprive our fellow citizens of objects worthy of their love. We suffer from an unrestrained, unleavened liberalism. Not liberalism. Liberalism is a good part of our tradition, but when it's unrestrained and unleavened by objects worthy of our love, it does become a problem. The open society imperatives have become all-powerful, even to the point of condemning love's loyalties as fascist, racist, or in some other way as sources of oppression. Insofar as our present leaders insist on the post-war consensus, they will bring woe and not peace. For absent opportunities for true and ennobling loves, of which patriotic ardor is surely one, people will default to demagogues and charlatans who will offer them false and debasing loves. Our job, I would submit, therefore, is to restore political life by developing a language of love, a vision of the we that befits our dignity and appeals to our reason as well as to our hearts. We need to become patrons of the strong gods, the ones that come from above and animate the best of our traditions. For I submit that only that kind of leadership will forestall the return of the dark gods that rise up from below. And my visit to St. Michael's Academy, and I've been to other great books, Catholic institutions, and it's my conviction that these kinds of institutions train young people to be patrons of these strong gods that are in fact worthy of our loyalty. Not every book that's read in this school teaches an unadulterated, unequivocal truth, but they train young people to desire truth and to have the courage to stand by truth. So it's my conviction that this kind of school will help us train the kind of leaders that will help us restore the very best of our traditions in the West, and to forestall, which I think the Open Society consensus is running out of gas, and to forestall the real dangers in the West, which are these debasing dark gods that rise up from below. Thank you very much.